I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we begin this edition of the show, as always, I'd like to remind you that you can support my work at patreon.com/parallaxviews. I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors, so I need your help to keep this show going. And you can do that by donating at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that out of the way, we have a very interesting conversation for you on this edition of the show with journalist Simon Parkin, author of the new book, The Forbidden Garden, The Botanists of Besieged Leningrad, and Their Impossible Choice. It's been named a Best Book of the Year by both Scientific American and The Economist, and it tells the story of a group of botanists in Leningrad that were faced with a choice of protecting a rare seed collection or eating those seeds as a matter of survival. It's one of those World War II stories that you may not have heard of, which makes it a perfect subject for this show. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Simon Parkin. Oh, and by the way, in the latter portion of the conversation, we'll also be discussing video games, because Simon is a video game journalist. So stick around for that as well. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to be speaking with. He has a fascinating new book out. Simon Parkin is the author of The Forbidden Garden, The Botanists of Besieged Leningrad, and Their Impossible Choice. How are you doing?
I'm really well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. And this book is rather fascinating. I'm still digging through it. It's a work of sort of historical narrative nonfiction. We'll get into what that means later. But I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about your previous book, and maybe is there a connection between that previous book and this book, at least in terms of the type of history you deal with? And for people that don't know, your previous book is The Island of Extraordinary Captives, a painter, a poet, an heiress, and a spy in a World War II British internment camp.
Yeah, of course. So I've actually written 3 books that are set in the 1940s now, and The Forbidden Garden's the most recent. So they're set during the Second World War, but I'm predominantly interested, I suppose, in just ordinary people doing heroic things. So they're not so much about military matters, although of course they're set within wartime, so there are war things happening. But I'm interested particularly in, I guess, ordinary lives and how they're impacted by the arrival of warfare. And so, my previous book, The Island of Extraordinary Captives, was about a group of refugees who came to Great Britain in the 1930s, before they were fleeing Nazi-controlled Europe, came to Britain seeking refuge. Then the war breaks out, and there's this mass panic, I suppose, stoked up by the newspapers and the media here in the UK that perhaps among some of those refugees there might be Nazi spies. And so anyone with a German or an Austrian passport, even if they were Jewish people or even if they had other reasons for fleeing Germany, was arrested and imprisoned on the Isle of Man, which is a tiny island in the middle of the Irish Sea. And I was writing about one of these camps that just happened to have a very high concentration of brilliant artists, musicians, writers, and really how, they were thrust together into this little camp and what they did with their time and how they turned it into this sort of art and educational institute and tried to make the best of their time using the skills that they had. And yeah, so I suppose there is a link with the Forbidden Garden, my current book, which is about the world's first seed bank situated in the middle of Leningrad, the city now known as St. Petersburg. And I'm writing about the botanists who work there. So this was a seed bank with around 250,000 seeds and plants, really the first of its kind that had been built up during the 1920s and 30s. Germany invades the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 and starts heading towards Leningrad. And by September 1941, they surround the city and start to, start the what is becomes the longest siege in recorded history. And they're trying to starve the city into submission, essentially. And so these botanists who work at the world's first seed bank there are dwindling food supplies in the city. People very quickly eat through all the food they've got in their homes and in their stores, and they soon start to starve to death. And so the botanists who are surrounded by this incredible bounty of food, not only seeds that were edible, but also nuts, tubers, potatoes, peas, all sorts of things, they're faced with this terrible decision. Should they eat the food that they're preserving for scientific purposes in order to sustain their own lives and those around them? Or should they protect those seeds so that when the siege eventually ends, they can continue their work and hopefully plant the fields and all of that? So I try to take us into the building during the siege and some of those difficult conversations and decisions that they were having to make.
So that leads to a very interesting question before we get into the players and the sort of characters that come up in this book. That sort of dilemma of, well, what choice do we make here? I feel like you were probably asking that while researching this, and it doesn't
Mhm.
seem like there's a definitive answer even by the end of reading the book.
Yeah, sure. Well, I should say the botanists do debate this question. Do we eat the seeds or do we preserve them? And they do decide amongst themselves that they're not going to eat any of the seeds at all, even the duplicate ones that they have. They're going to preserve every single seed. And as a result, at least 19 of them starved to death as a result of that difficult decision. So, it's an incredibly consequential choice that they make. And yeah, that's something that I try to grapple with in the book, and particularly towards the end. Did they make the moral choice, really? They were choosing to allow themselves, their colleagues, and potentially other people in the city to starve to death for the benefit of the imagined sort of later benefits. Perhaps through scientific study, they would be able to create work later after the war that would, help end famine and things like that. So it's really a question of, do those long-term potential benefits, are they worth potentially making sacrifices in the short term for? And the way that it was perhaps difficult for me to understand. I'm not a plant scientist. I'm a writer. This isn't the sort of thing that I'm faced with, that kind of dilemma. But after the war, a journalist in, I think, the 1960s went to visit one of the survivors who had made this choice, one of the botanists who had been there, and said, how could you make this choice? And he said, well, you're a writer. Imagine you had spent 10, 15 years working on an incredible book. It was your life's work. And then you're in a situation where you're freezing to death, and the only thing you've got around you to burn is your manuscript. It's the only copy. What would you do? Would you set fire to it in order to keep you alive for a little bit longer, or would you say, no, I'm not going to touch it? Its value is greater than my comfort or my life even. And he said, well, maybe now you can understand why we made the decision we did. So that was helpful for me, I think, to sort of understand the way that they viewed their work and
To
what
understand their
the,
perspective on it. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So then that brings us to this figure of Nikolai Vavilov. Maybe you could talk a little bit about his background and history and how he ends up in what is now St. Petersburg, but then was Petrograd.
Yeah, so he was an explorer and a botanist, sort of bright young scientist who um, starts teaching at Saratov University when he's still fairly young, and he receives a letter from another botanist working in Petrograd. It's a little confusing because the city we're talking about has three names: St. Petersburg, Petrograd, and Leningrad, but it's all the same place. At the time, this is in 1921, it's called Petrograd. And yeah, Vavilov receives an invitation. Will you come? Move to Petrograd and take over this little plant institute that we've got going. So they'd gathered around 12,000 seeds, this idea of building up kind of a library of seeds and plants. And Vavilov agrees to it. He says, yes, I'll come. He takes a number of his students, I think 27 of his colleagues and students, he takes with him on the train. This is a huge journey from Saratov to Petrograd. They arrive and sort of find the city. It's just post the revolution. Petrograd's in a bad state, and in fact, the scientists who work at the plant institute have eaten some of the samples that they have there. So they arrive into a real mess. And really, over the next few years, Vavilov begins the work of building up the collection. And by the mid to late 1920s, he and his colleagues are traveling all around the world. They go to North America, they go to Great Britain, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, India, Afghanistan. And everywhere they go, Vavilov is meeting with farmers, meeting with scientists, saying, can you give me some of the seeds that are indigenous to where you live that you perhaps use for farming? And then bringing those back to Russia so that he and his colleagues can run experiments on them and start to build essentially this library, huge library of plants. And his aim is to get one copy of every seed in the world and bring it to the Plant Institute. And it becomes very well known, and Vavilov becomes very well known as well. And had we been having this conversation in the 1930s, we would probably, everyone listening would know who Vavilov was, because he traveled everywhere. He was, always greeted by dignitaries and all of that sort of thing. So yeah, that's how he winds up in St. Petersburg. That's how he forms what becomes the Plant Institute and builds it up to be this collection of around 250,000 seeds and plants. But he does run afoul of Stalin's regime in the late 1940s. Science was hugely politicized, and
I want to get into
Vavilov.
that, but
Oh yeah,
yeah.
sure, sure.
Well, what I wanted to ask you about was how much does a figure like the very controversial and at this point, you know, uh, deeply discredited scientist Lysenko tie into a
Mm.
story like this?
Well, Lysenko was another botanist, a bit like Vavilov, who's rising to prominence in the late 20s and 30s. Lysenko has quite different botanical biological theories to Vavilov. So Vavilov believes, correctly, as we now know, as all scientists agree, that you can plants will inherit the qualities of the plants that they're genetically paired with, and so you can crossbreed different varieties of plant and crossbreed the qualities of those, and that's how many of the crops that farmers use around the world. That's how they've got high yielding crops or crops that are resistant to disease. Lysenko's theory was that, in fact, plants acquire the characteristics of wherever it is that they're planted. So if you plant, a specimen in a cold climate, it will become resistant to the cold as a result of that. So they've got quite opposed ideas, and Lysenko has the benefit in Stalin's eyes of coming from, he's a peasant farmer, so he's, sort of ideologically more useful to Stalin, whereas Vavilov's from a very well-to-do family. And more to the point, there's been waves of famine in the Soviet Union, and there's this real pressing need for the scientists to increase the amount of crops in order to feed the population. And Lysenko promises Stalin that he'll be able to increase the crop yield in a much shorter amount of time than Vavilov is. So for this reason, and some other political reasons, Lysenko gets promoted and promoted up the ranks, whereas Vavilov increasingly becomes sidelined. And partly that's as well because Vavilov is world famous and, really a proponent of international collaboration and things that Stalin finds distrustful. So, yeah, that's why Lysenko overtakes him, despite his science being founded on incorrect theories. And it's also why Vavilov ends up being arrested in 1940. He's out collecting specimens on a mountainside when a black car pulls up. Four shady looking characters get out and say, Vavilov, you're needed with us in Moscow on important business. But in fact, they were lying, and they were members of the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB, which everyone's heard of. And he was arrested and found guilty of spying for the British, which wasn't true. Put on a sort of, he was underwent these huge, long uh, um, interrogations, which were very brutal, and then is tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. And so, at the start of the Siege of Leningrad, which I mentioned right at the beginning, Vavilov is in fact in prison, and his colleagues, the botanists working there, have got no leader to speak of. It was certainly not Vavilov is anywhere to be seen.
So what are the struggles they face protecting these seeds? I mean, before we get into that, for an audience that may be very layman about all of this, why are these seeds so important? Why is this collection so important?
Well, Vavilov believed that it was important to build up this collection because there may be plants whose genetic qualities have been overlooked by farmers thousands of years ago when they were picking what wheat they were going to use. So he really was particularly interested in wild varieties of plant that might have special characteristics that he could crossbreed into the kind of seeds and crops that were used by farmers. So that was, there was this belief that within the collection there were very valuable genetic qualities, and the scientific work that they had to do was to try to create or breed what we would now term super crops. These are, of course, the theories and the practices that farmers have used throughout the 20th century and use today. Um, as well as that, I suppose the secondary point, and which is particularly pertinent for us today, is that there were seeds within this collection that had been collected from territories that had disappeared through, human habitation or warfare or whatever it might be. And so some of these seeds were incredibly rare and maybe even irreplaceable. So that's why it was so important. Um, yeah, sorry, what was the other part of your question?
In terms of protecting the seeds,
Oh,
because I mean
yeah,
they're getting like raided by starving
yes.
citizens who have their own hunger. Like it's a very complex picture.
Yeah. Well, as I say, yeah, it's not long before the food supplies really run out in Leningrad. There's around 3 million people in the city at the start of the siege. That's a lot of people to feed. And because the Nazi troops have surrounded the city, there's very few drops of food drops coming in, a few over the lake that are coming in by air, but not nearly enough to feed everyone. So, yes, as desperation increases, by the time you get to November 1941, yeah, there are people trying to break into the seed bank to get hold of them. By this
It's
point as
hard to
well,
blame them in a way too. I mean,
hard to
you know,
blame them, absolutely, yeah. But they've also got an issue with vermin because across the city, many families had been forced to butcher their cats and dogs in order to feed their families. And as a result, there'd been an explosion in rats and mice, and they can obviously smell the seeds in the seed bank on St. Isaac Square. And so, yeah, that winter they're assaulted by plagues of rats really that are trying to get into the rooms where the seeds are in their little metallic containers, tin containers. And so yeah, they're having to the botanists are having to take measures to fend off the vermin, and then from almost as soon as the siege begins, the Germans are dropping bombs on the city, and I think more than 100 incendiary bombs land on the roof of the institute. So, as well as everything else, the botanists are having to work as firemen and women, and some of them are stationed on the roof, and every time an incendiary bomb lands, they're kicking it off into the courtyard, and then some of the other botanists down there are throwing sand on it to extinguish it as quickly as possible. So, in addition to all of that, they've got the extreme cold. It was a very, very cold winter in 1941, so they're trying to keep the tubers in particularly alive by keeping the temperature above freezing. So they've got potatoes in the cellar that risk dying if the temperature falls to freezing. So they're trying to find firewood to keep themselves alive, to keep the samples alive. Yeah, the challenges that face them are multitudinous. Yeah.
And they're of course dealing with the same kind of hunger and malnourishment as well. So I bet a lot of people are asking, well, why didn't they just eat the seeds?
Yeah, that's right. But they really didn't. And in fact, one of the most poignant stories in the book comes on Christmas Day, 1941, when Nikolai Ivanov, who was one of the leaders during the siege in the seed bank, he knocks on the office door of one of his colleagues, Alexander Stuchkin, who is a groundnut expert, knocks on the door, opens it, and Stuchkin is sitting motionless at his desk, and Ivanov goes over, tries to rouse him by shaking his shoulder, and it's clear that Stuchkin has died in his desk. And as he shakes him, a packet of almonds falls out of Stuchkin's hand onto the desk, and it seemed that Stuchkin had been categorizing these samples even at the moment that he perished. So it just shows the amount of resolve that these men and women had.
And I believe 19 of the staff died, correct?
Yeah, that's the confirmed number from the records that I've been able to, sort of piece together in conjunction with some of the people who work at the seed bank now today. But yeah, there may have been more, and other people died. Other botanists who worked there were sent to the front and died fighting, and others died through, the bombing of their homes. But yes, 19, I believe, had on their death certificates dystrophia, which was what the state used to refer to starvation.
In delving into this story, I guess what was your conclusion about what drove their conviction? Because that takes an incredible amount of resolve, and there had to be this conviction there. So maybe you can speak to that. I know it's hard to get inside the head of these people because we're not
Mm.
there, and so much of documentation isn't necessarily there for us. We can't go back in time with a time machine, but it really is a story about conviction at its heart. I think that's one of the main themes in this story. So can you speak to that a little bit more?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there are various factors. As I said, when they turned those staff who had turned up in 1921 to Petrograd and seen that some of their predecessors had eaten some of the seeds, I think they had, sort of made a vow between themselves that if they were ever in that situation, they would preserve the collection. Then, there's the fact that they'd spent 20 years collecting seeds from all around the world. This was a huge, costly endeavor. And so the idea that you would have been very, very difficult, I think, when you've spent all of that
Could
effort.
you repeat that? You said the idea of
The idea of that you would just sort of consume all of that effort and the work of your colleagues over a 2 decade period. I think there was a sense of mutual responsibility to each other. If one of your close friends and colleagues had traveled to South America and over a period of months had dug up very rare South American varieties of potato and brought them all the way back to the Soviet Union, that would be, you probably wouldn't just boil them up and eat them. You would think very carefully about that. There was also the fact that Vavilov, for those botanists who were very loyal to Vavilov, as many of them were, he wasn't around. He was in prison, and they didn't know what was going to happen to him. So I think they certainly felt loyalty toward him and wanting to do the right thing for Vavilov, especially when he'd undergone this very difficult situation of being arrested by the state and put on trial. And then Yeah, just the sense, as I said earlier, that this was your life's work, and the idea that you would just almost destroy it in an act of trying to preserve yourself was difficult. It is one of the challenges for writing this book was trying to piece together the truth of those discussions. How many arguments were there among themselves? Was it a very difficult decision? Were there dissenters who said this, we're making the wrong decision here? There are only really a couple of mentions of this in the few diaries and memoirs that exist, because of course immediately after the war you had to be very careful about what you said and what you wrote down. And, there was still a risk that you could be arrested and tried all the way through to the 1970s, really. You didn't want to say the right thing. So it takes a long time for the truth of what happened to emerge, many decades. And even then, reading the accounts, you sort of feel like they've been somewhat sanitized. So I can't say for certain, that there weren't screaming matches about this, but that certainly doesn't seem to be the case from the sources that we have.
So I want to word this very carefully, but I know there's some people out there, and even myself, maybe I have this knee-jerk reaction of, and it's because I'm not a botanist, but I almost want to say like, well, these people are crazy. Like they're risking their own lives by not just for this plant collection. And I mean, the idea that that they're putting this plant collection before their own lives, it's just hard for me to wrap my head around. But then at the same time, I also have to admire that level of conviction. I guess there's not a question in that, but just I'm commenting and wondering what your thoughts are on
Yeah.
how I'm looking at it. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's difficult for many of us to get into that mindset. I would say that, we do see in conflict zones around the world, curators of museums and other collections do make these very difficult choices, and they do see, they do feel immense responsibility for the collections, which, you know, I suppose in the case of a museum, it's very obvious if you've got a masterwork there that was completely irreplaceable, you can see why you might be tempted to give your life to protect that. These are, in the case of the Hermitage Art Museum, which was across the street from the Plant Institute in Leningrad, that was certainly, they were doing everything they could to protect their collection. And we do see that today as well in conflict zones. So I think they felt the same way. These were seeds, they're not paintings, they're not priceless pieces of gold or things that have been dug up from the Roman Empire or whatever, but they did view them as sort of living artifacts, things that carry all of this historical genetic information in them, and that are equally worthwhile saving as a masterwork painting.
That actually helps me make that makes it more understandable for me because I remember when I was growing up, I saw the looting of those museums. It was reported in the media during the Iraq War, and it's
Right,
like to me, oh my
exactly.
God, history is being lost. But it's really the same way with these botanists in a way. They don't
I
want
think
that.
so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's their life work. So in terms of this story, you said that at one point Vavilov was really a well-known figure. How does his name get lost to history, and then how does it get revived?
Well, the Vavilov's fate is really unknown. He dies during the war before the siege ends. He's ironically back in Saratov, where he had been a university lecturer. He's in a prison there, and he starves to death. It takes a while for the what happened to be discovered. One of his sons goes and receives the confirmation, but it's really thanks to the work of an academic in the 1960s, a chap called Mark Popovsky, who lived in the Soviet Union, who decides to go on the trail to try to find out what happened to Vavilov, and he visits the site of the prison, and he tracks down the nurses who looked after him. He tracks down the person who did the post-mortem, and he writes up his findings in what eventually becomes a book called The Vavilov Affair. and he manages to smuggle it out of the Soviet Union in the 60s and the 70s. A huge personal risk. One of his friends says to him, this book project you're doing, there must be easy ways to commit suicide, because Russia at that point did not want the story of what happened to Vavilov to get out because it was extremely damning. But yeah, Popovsky was extremely brave, and he did manage to get the story out. The book is long out of print and there aren't many copies, but I did go through all of his papers that are at Columbia University. So it's he did a lot of the research for which I was able to draw from when writing the Vavilov component of this story. Yeah, which is sort of one half of it, I suppose.
Before we start wrapping up, I guess I had two more questions about this specific book, and that's the first one is what do you think this book can tell us about that moment in history and also that moment in Soviet history?
I think the Siege of Leningrad is a very well covered topic, I would say, particularly for anyone who's interested in the Second World War and particularly in Soviet history during the Second World War. And it's a story as well that anyone who comes from St. Petersburg has lived with, and there's a sort of generational memory of it in their families. And so I do believe I read one stat that said since the end of the Second World War, I think a book has been published on the Siege of Leningrad at a rate of one a week ever since then. So there's a huge amount of material, but actually almost no books about what happened at the Plant Institute. There was just one short length book that was published in Russia in 1979. So
Right, there hasn't been a book published outside of Russia on this specific case. Yeah.
yeah, and even the one that was published sort of blended fact and fiction to a certain degree. So part of my hope in writing this book, of course, the academics have studied it and it is well known among the seed bank community, but it was really to bring the story to wider appreciation, to also try to uncover new details, and to contextualize the work that they did in the bigger story about the Siege of Leningrad, in the bigger story about the Eastern Front during the Second World War. It's a very different kind of story to the normal one we would read about the Siege of Leningrad. It's really to do with very, very big questions, I think. What sacrifices are permissible in the name of science is really the question that underpins it. And the the sacrifice that they made is, even though it happened 80 years ago, it's still deeply relevant, I think. We see the conflict around the world is constantly threatening the collections, whether they're botanical or other. And of course, other the it's not only conflict, it's also human habitation, it's climate change, it's all of these other things that are hugely threatening food security in nations. Just make this kind of story extremely pressing, I think, even today. So, yeah, there's an awful lot of resonance, I think, for readers in 2025.
And the other question I had was, what are the struggles in telling this story in that sort of historical narrative nonfiction mode? Because you don't have access to the like inner worlds of these people that you're writing about, but you're trying to paint a picture of how they would have talked, how they would have um, maybe had those shouting matches and whatnot. So what are the hurdles in doing historical narrative nonfiction?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there are two kinds of history book, right? There's the one where and we have this kind of book a lot where I live in the UK, where it would be, the name of a city, Stalingrad, or and it will be like a huge brick of a book, and it will be a historian trying to tell every single story that happened within that particular battle or whatever, if we're talking about military history. The other way of doing it is what I'm trying to do with this book and my other books, which is to tell a specific story within a context of a battle. And that's there's lots of great things about doing that. I think you can employ some novelistic techniques. You try to, you can really focus in on particular characters and make it a human story as much as a subject story. But of course, exactly as you say, the challenges with that are You don't want to be putting words in people's mouths. You don't want to be using your imagination to fill in the blanks, and there were always blanks with doing this kind of work. Um, so it's trying to use some of those techniques from fiction writing, but in a way where you don't cross any lines, I think, and make things up, fabricate basically. So yeah, those were the big challenges. Were trying to get across perhaps some of the tensions or the conflicts that would have happened in the seed bank in those very difficult months, where perhaps the source material is just has blanks or is just silent on those issues, and you do the best you can, and you, I suppose, highlight those places where you are frustrated that you weren't able to fill in particular blanks, and you so those are some of the ways that I try to deal with that. But yeah,
Is what
it's always a
attracted to
balancing
you
act.
the not to interrupt you, but is what attracted you to the story the human element? Because that's the thing. I love a good history book, but even more so, I love a book that deals with history but gets into the human drama rather than just reciting the facts. And I feel like that's what draws you to a lot of these stories that you've written about.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, certainly that's my hope with the work I do, and that's the ambition at least, yeah.
I if you have 5 more minutes, I was wondering if we could shift gears. I wanted to ask you about your video game journalism because it seems like a completely different um, topic, and I'm just wondering how did you get into video game journalism, and then maybe you could tell my listeners about your latest piece in the New Yorker.
Yeah, so I started out as a freelance journalism covering video games. That's really how I began, and writing for the specialist press for magazines here in the UK and then for the internet. And it was through covering the game. I think having a beat, there's nothing wrong with having a beat, right? And learning, there are good, interesting stories, whether you're writing about film, about pop music, about foreign wars, or about video games, whatever it is, there's always good stories. There's always stories that illuminate the human condition or the systems of the world. And that's absolutely true in games. And for me, that's just where I started out. That happened to be the thing I was writing about and learning about. And actually, I got into writing these narrative nonfiction books set during the Second World War because I was working on a radio piece for the New Yorker about war games. And these are the games that governments and militaries play, like board games, really, to imagine potential outcomes of situations in the world. So, for example, if there's a difficult international situation. Let's say prior to the invasion of Ukraine, the American government was worried that Vladimir Putin might invade Ukraine. They would have run war games to imagine, right, let's imagine Russia invades Ukraine. What might happen there? So they play a game where different military officers would assume the roles of different countries, and they would play a game to sort of see what the potential outcomes were in order to understand what their reactions might be. And yeah, I was doing this interviewing a major here in the UK who is one of the designers of these games. I said, "Oh, have you got an example of where something learned in a game was useful in the real world?" And he told me about a story in the Second World War, how a naval officer had designed a game to help Britain understand why the U-boats were sinking so many of its ships in the Battle of the Atlantic, and that turned into my first book, A Game of Birds and Wolves. So it's a bit of a transition, but I was interested in games and game design and how games can impact the real world, and that's what led me to that book. And then I wrote more books about the Second World War. So that's my sort of journey. But it's always just about my interest in the world, my interest in people, my interest in I suppose how games can impact the real world. And that's certainly the case with the piece that you mentioned there that I just published,
This is
which is a
how a school shooting became a video game.
yeah. So I heard in late last year, in about October, that the parents of Joaquin Oliver, who was murdered in the Parkland, Florida school shooting in 2018, had released a video game on Steam, or a computer game, I should say, in which you play as a student during an active school shooting. It seems a very taboo subject to me, but also extremely interesting that the parents of a victim of one of these incidents would have put their name to this sort of project. So, yeah, I just wanted to find out what led them to do that. Whether the game is when you're making a game like that that's really trying to draw public attention to the issues and maybe campaign for changes in particular gun laws in Florida or whatever it might be. Um, when you've got a game like that, the goal isn't necessarily to make it as fun as possible or to keep people playing for as long as possible, which are the sort of things that game designers normally do. And if you're making Call of Duty, you're trying to get people to play Call of Duty every day. If you're making a game like this school shooting game, your aim isn't to get people playing it forever and spending money on costumes on skins or whatever. Your aim is to start a conversation. So I
So
was in
it's neither like one of these games that's trying to get you to buy microtransactions, but it's also, I think when people hear school shooting game, they're thinking, if you're really into weird video games, there was stuff like there's these shock games that were made like Super
right.
Columbine RPG, and it's not that
Hmm.
either. It's
No,
actually trying to start an actual conversation rather than being just a way to get microtransactions done,
definitely. Yeah,
or
yeah,
like a
it's
shock piece. Yeah.
yeah, it's neither of the. Well, yes. I mean, it's for free, so you don't pay any money for it. It only lasts 10 minutes, and that's because the makers of the game say that's the average length of time of a school shooting. So yeah, it's something that's meant to just be played over a 10-minute period, and then starts a conversation. Really, there is a certain amount of shock value because I wouldn't have wanted to write about it. We wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't in some way provocative or transgressive, right? So, they are definitely trying to shock because you hear the idea, oh, the parents of a victim of a school shooting made a video game about school shootings. That's interesting, at least. Why would they do that? So yeah, I think there is a certain element of shock behind it, but it's fair, as far as
I
it
think
could
it's
be.
very different than the usual type of yeah.
Yeah, there's no gore in it. It's, to this might be the wrong way of putting it, but it's tastefully done in the sense that most of the violence is heard rather than seen, and things like that. So they certainly tried to you know, tread a careful line with what they've made. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask one more question on the video game stuff. I promise to let you go, and I know we could
Yeah,
probably
sure.
devote a whole episode to this, but
Okay.
one thing I've always thought about video games, and I got out of video games like fairly young, probably after the sixth generation consoles, but it always sort of made me sad. I felt like there's always been this idea that video games weren't or aren't, works of art, or they can't be that. They're just these sort of passing diversions. And I think there's always these glimpses we see of people trying to push the medium to be more than just a passing diversion. There was an indie game I played a
Hmm.
while back called Hotline Miami that I think did some really
Hmm.
interesting things story wise. Do you think that
Yeah.
where is the state of gaming when it comes to uh, developers that really want to push this medium into being more than just a diversion, that do want to treat it as an art form? Because I think it is an art form ultimately.
Yeah, I think, there's certainly many very talented creative developers that are certainly trying to do that. And you've got that at the blockbuster end of things with companies like Naughty Dog who are trying to make, sort of cinematic style games like The Last of Us that has then gone on to become a hit prestige TV show. But you've also got it at the independent end of the sector with games like Papers, Please, which are trying to, yeah, to tell a very interesting story in a way that only a video game could do. And for me, those are particularly interesting. And yeah, there's certainly been a lot of efforts to do that. And the question of whether games can be art or not is something that's been raging on for 30 years. I think the film critic Roger Ebert caused a big stir when he said games could never be art, and people got very upset. But it's, yeah, an ongoing conversation. I mean, for me, the big risk to that at the moment, or the thing that's threatening video games legitimacy as a potential art form, is really
Does
the
it involve
fact that
Fortnite?
well, there's nothing wrong with Fortnite or with Call of Duty Warzone or with any of those big games, but and I enjoy and play them. But I would say, there is companies are increasingly trying to make their games more like Instagram or TikTok, in the sense that they want them to be part of your daily routine, something that you go back to every day. It's where you meet your friends for a game. It's where you spend your money. You play that game forever. And the reason they want to do that is because it's very expensive to make games. And so, why not? If you can make a game that people come back to all the time, why not do that? But I think the social mediaification of video games is quite threatening towards the health of the ecosystem, because it kind of sucks up all the money and the investment, and it stops companies perhaps so much investing in games that just want to tell a 5-hour story with a really interesting game mechanic, or with a really, really, in moving narrative with a start, a middle, and end. Those kind of games are really threatened, I think, in the current ecosystem. So I don't think they're ever going to go away. But yes, I'm concerned, I would say, about the current state of how games are made and funded.
In closing, what do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation, and how can they get the book? And what do you hope they get out of the book? I guess, The Forbidden Garden.
Well, I would love it if people are interested enough to read the book. I think, it is a hard story in some ways, and there are, there are grim parts to it, but it's also a story of hope. And, there were positive outcomes that came from the botanist decision, and that we still see the results of today. And so I think it's a good story, but also a hopeful one as well, despite all the darkness in it. So yeah, people can pick up the book wherever they get their books. You can also listen to the audio version of the book. It's on Spotify and whatever, iTunes, wherever you listen to your books. I'm sure you'll be able to find a copy as well. So yeah, I guess I hope people take an interest in that. And if they want to read more of my work, my website's just simonparkin.com. It's really simple, and they can find more there.
Do you also have I thought I read that you had a podcast as well.
I do have a podcast. Yeah, thanks for mentioning it. Yeah, it's video game related, but again, like our conversation here, hopefully taking in broader things as well. So in each episode, I invite a well-known guest to come on and pick the 5 video games they want to put on their perfect console, and then we talk about those games and what they mean to them, as well as their career. So I've had people like Ronan Farrow on, and I'm going blank now, but we've been going for 2 years, so there's more than 100 episodes. So yeah, we've had some really, really wonderful guests. Danny Pudi from Community, the TV show, all sorts of things, people like that, as well as many people who work in the video game industry. And we get into some of the things that we've talked about here today as well. It's called My Perfect Console, I should say.
Well, I hope people listen to My Perfect Console, and they'll get a copy of the book, The Forbidden Garden. Thank you again, Simon Parkin, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. If you support the work I'm doing here, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.